Roll on 2.
Getting molten gold poured down your throat sounds like a nightmare, but imagine being kicked around like a soccer ball by an elephant, with sharp blades strapped to its feet. Not exactly a good time. Imagine your ribs being yanked out from your back or rats slowly gnawing away at your face. Yep, it gets worse. These aren't just horror stories, they're real torture methods from history. So brace yourself, because what you're about to hear isn't just disturbing, it's downright terrifying. Number 15. The Brazen Bull. Imagine a massive bronze statue shaped like a bull, completely hollow on the inside. It sits over a roaring fire, and inside it, a person is locked up, trapped and slowly cooked alive. But here's the most disturbing part. Clever metal pipes ran from the inside to the bull's mouth, turning the victim's screams into sounds that mimicked the bellowing of a real, angry bull. This nightmare machine was known as the Brazen Bull, and the story comes from an ancient Greek historian named Diodorus Siculus, who wrote a 40-volume history called Bibliotheca Historica. According to him, the bull was invented by a skilled sculptor from Athens named Parallaeus. He made it as a gift, or more like a twisted invention, for a Sicilian ruler named Phalaris, who ruled around 570 BC and was infamous for being not just cruel, but disturbingly sadistic. Some stories even claim he ate his enemies. Parallaeus proudly showed off the bull, saying the screams would sound like music through the pipes. Phalaris, amused but wicked, asked for a demonstration. Then came the dark twist. He told Parallaeus to climb inside. And once he did, Phalaris lit the fire himself. Before Parallaeus could die, he was yanked out and thrown off a cliff. Phalaris didn't want to ruin his shiny new death machine with a burned body. Over time, the story of the Brazen Bull spread like wildfire. Even the Roman philosopher Cicero mentioned it as a symbol of heartless tyranny. Some later tales claimed early Christians were killed using the bull too, though most historians think that part was exaggerated or made up. Number 14. Pena Kool. Back in ancient Rome, there was a punishment so brutal that it almost sounds made up. It was called Pena Kool, which means penalty of the sack, and it was saved for one of the worst crimes imaginable back then, killing your father or any parent. At first, around 100 or 200 BC, the punishment was simple. They'd tie the person up in a sack and toss them into a river. But the Romans, being Romans, made it much more twisted over time. First, the guilty person was beaten with sticks. Then they'd put a creepy wolfskin hood on his head and strap on wooden clogs. Next came the infamous sack, usually made from tough ox leather. But the real horror was what went in with him. Inside that sack were live animals, often a mix of a monkey, a dog, a rooster, and a snake. So, as he lay there bleeding, trapped in darkness, he also had to fight for his life against panicked, possibly aggressive animals. Then the sack, now a chaotic mess, was tossed into the water. The idea was, you don't just die, you suffer. Roman thinkers like Cicero believed this punishment kept the killer from polluting the earth, water, or even animals. They thought the crime was so disgusting that it offended the gods. One of the earliest recorded cases was Marcus Publicius Malleolus, who killed his mother. He got the sack, minus the animals. Later emperors like Claudius reportedly preferred this over crucifixion. It eventually faded out, but not entirely. It popped up again in medieval Germany, even into the 18th century, where cats, dogs, or non-venomous snakes were sometimes added. Number 13. Lethal injection. In 1977, Oklahoma became the first state to adopt lethal injection as the method of execution. But it wasn't until 1982 that Charles Brooks was the first person to be executed by this method in Texas. Nowadays, every state with the death penalty uses lethal injection as the standard procedure. The process typically begins with the condemned person being strapped to a gurney, with heart monitors attached to their skin. Several 4 needles are inserted into veins, usually in the arms, and connected to long tubes that lead to intravenous drips. The first drip is a harmless saline solution, which is started immediately. At the warden's signal, a curtain is raised, revealing the prisoner to witnesses in an adjacent room. The execution then proceeds based on the state's chosen protocol, either single or multi-drug. In a single-drug execution, the prisoner is injected with a lethal dose of pentobarbital. In a multi-drug procedure, the process starts with a sedative like midazolam, which is intended to put the prisoner to sleep. Next, a paralytic drug, such as vecuronium bromide, is administered to paralyze the body and stop the prisoner from breathing. Finally, potassium chloride is injected to stop the heart, leading to death from anesthetic overdose and cardiac and respiratory failure, all while the prisoner is unconscious. Doctors are ethically prohibited from participating in executions, but one will confirm the prisoner's death afterward. This absence of medical involvement can sometimes cause issues. If an untrained execution team member accidentally injects the drug into the muscle instead of a vein, it can cause immense pain. Some prisoners have damaged veins from previous drug use, making it harder to find a suitable vein and leading to long delays during the execution. Number 12. Gas chamber. In 1924, Nevada became the first state to experiment with cyanide gas as a more humane way of executing prisoners. G. John, a convicted murderer, was the first person to face this method. At first, the plan was to pump cyanide gas into John's cell while he slept, but it failed as the gas leaked out. As a result, a sealed gas chamber was built. Fast forward to today, and 5 states still allow lethal gas as a method of execution. In the gas chamber, the condemned person is strapped to a chair inside an airtight room. Below them sits a bucket of sulfuric acid. A stethoscope is attached so a doctor outside can monitor the prisoner. Once everyone leaves the chamber, the warden signals the executioner to release sodium cyanide crystals into the acid, causing a chemical reaction that produces deadly hydrogen cyanide gas. The prisoner is urged to breathe deeply, though most try to hold their breath, struggling for air. Death comes from hypoxia, a lack of oxygen to the brain. Former San Quentin warden Clifton Duffy described the process as horrifying, with the prisoner often showing signs of severe pain and panic. Carroll Chessman, executed in 1960, reportedly nodded his head in pain for minutes before his death. In recent years, states like Oklahoma and Alabama have explored new methods of execution. In 2018, Alabama introduced nitrogen hypoxia, where a person is deprived of oxygen by breathing pure nitrogen, leading to suffocation. The first use of this method was in January 2024, when Kenneth Smith was executed. Number 11. Rat torture. Rat torture is one of those gruesome practices from the darker corners of history that continues to pop up in modern pop culture. The basic idea behind rat torture is disturbingly simple. A live rat, often starving, diseased, or aggressive, is placed inside a metal or clay container. This container is then positioned on a victim's bare stomach or chest. The open end of the container is secured to the body, usually by tying it down or pressing it firmly in place so the rat can't escape. Then comes the most terrifying part. The container is slowly heated, usually with fire or hot coals. As the metal gets hotter, the rat inside starts to panic. Desperate to escape the unbearable heat, it starts burrowing in the only direction it can, straight through the victim's flesh. The result is not just excruciating pain, but pure psychological terror. Victims could feel and hear the rat chewing its way into their bodies, sometimes reaching vital organs. Death wasn't always immediate either. In many cases, people would survive the initial attack, only to die later from infections, blood loss, or internal injuries. Historically, rat torture was used in several parts of the world, especially during times of political unrest or tyranny. One of the most notorious examples comes from 17th century Europe, where the Dutch reportedly used rats to punish prisoners. Later, during the brutal reign of South American dictatorships in the 20th century, reports of similar torture tactics surfaced in Chile under Pinochet's regime. Number 10. Electrocution. Back in the late 18th century, New York was looking for a kinder way to carry out executions than hanging. So, in 1888, they built the very first electric chair. 2 years later, in 1890, a man named William Kemmler became the first person to be executed using it. After that, other states followed suit. But over time, as people questioned how humane it was, electrocution slowly faded away. By 2008, Nebraska, its last holdout, was forced to stop using it as the sole method after its Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. Here's how it worked. The person would be shaved and strapped tightly into a wooden chair using belts across their chest, arms, legs, and groin. A metal cap was placed on their head over a salty, wet sponge. Too wet, and it wouldn't work properly. Too dry, and it could make things worse. Another electrode, smeared with jelly to conduct electricity, was attached to a shaved part of the leg. Then came the blindfold. When everyone left the room, the warden gave the signal. The executioner pulled a lever, sending a brutal surge of electricity, anywhere from 500 to 200 volts, for about 30 seconds. If the heart was still beating after the first jolt, they'd do it again, until there were no signs of life. The body often shook violently. Hands clenched the chair, bones could break, skin would swell, and sometimes there'd be smoke or even flames. The smell of burning flesh filled the room. Sometimes the prisoner's eyes would pop out, and the body would release waste and fluids. Number 9. Lingchi. Lingchi, or slow slicing, was one of the most grotesque and agonizing methods of execution in Chinese history. Also known as death by 1,000 cuts, this form of punishment was designed to prolong the victim's suffering to the maximum. The condemned person was tied to a post, often in a public square, and over a prolonged period, pieces of their skin, flesh, and limbs were sliced off, starting with the least vital parts and moving to more critical areas. The process could take hours, and in some cases, it was drawn out for days. The execution would usually end with a fatal blow to the heart or decapitation, but not always. Lingchi dates back to the 10th century, during the Tang dynasty, and persisted for nearly 1,000 years. It was used for the most heinous crimes, such as treason, corruption, or rebellion, especially if the crime was considered an act against the emperor or the state. What made it even more brutal was that it wasn't just about punishing the individual. It was a public spectacle meant to instill fear and show the consequences of defying the state. Spectators were often encouraged to watch, adding a layer of humiliation and terror for the condemned person. This method was considered the ultimate disgrace, as it was believed that the souls of the executed could not rest peacefully, especially if they were executed without proper burial rites. The execution was a slow and methodical act, carried out with a sharp blade, usually by experienced executioners who knew exactly how to inflict the most pain while keeping the victim alive for as long as possible. This horrifying practice was abolished in 1905 by the Qing dynasty. Number 8. Molten metal swallow. Imagine a more fitting punishment for a greedy person than having molten gold poured straight into their mouth. Well, that's exactly what happened to a Spanish conquistador named Pedro de Valdivia in the 16th century. Valdivia had been fighting the Mapuche people in Chile, but after losing a battle, he fled on horseback, hoping to escape with their gold. Unfortunately for him, his horse got stuck in a marsh, and he was captured by the Mapuche. While we know for sure he met his end at the hands of the Mapuche, there's some debate about how exactly he died. One account suggests they went the traditional route, ripping out his heart and even eating it. But another account, from fellow conquistador Pedro Marinho de Lobera, says they took a much more gruesome approach, pouring molten gold down his throat. This symbolic act of death would have been incredibly fast. The molten gold would have caused the organs to rupture, and the intense heat would have likely killed him almost instantly, as the gold would quickly cause severe damage to the lungs and shock the body. If the Mapuche were truly clever, they might have fed him small amounts of molten gold to prolong the suffering. Interestingly, this kind of death wasn't unheard of in history. Emperor Constantine included a law that said if a nurse helped a man steal a female slave, the nurse would face molten lead poured down her throat as punishment. There's even another case from 1599 where a Spanish governor in Ecuador, guilty of greed, faced a similar fate. When he swallowed the gold, his organs reportedly burst right away. Number 7. Hanging. Up until the 1890s, hanging was the most common way people were executed in the United States. It remained legal in Delaware and Washington until both states finally got rid of the death penalty. Delaware in 2016 and Washington in 2018. When hanging was used, there was a lot of preparation involved. A day before the execution, the prisoner was usually weighed, and a practice run was done using a sandbag that weighed the same. This helped figure out exactly how far the person should drop to make the death as quick and painless as possible. Too short a drop, and the person could slowly suffocate for up to 45 minutes. Too long, and it could result in a gruesome decapitation. Even the rope had to be specially prepared. It was boiled and stretched to remove any springiness and coiling, and then lubricated with soap or wax so it would slide smoothly. According to a 1969 United States Army manual, all these steps were crucial for the execution to go by the book. Right before the hanging, the prisoner's hands and legs were tied, they were blindfolded, and the noose was carefully placed around their neck, with the knot just behind the left ear. When the trapdoor opened, the prisoner would fall, and the goal was to break the neck instantly by the force of the drop. But even with all the preparation, things didn't always go as planned. If the person had a strong neck, didn't weigh enough, or the drop wasn't long enough, the neck wouldn't snap, and instead, the person would die slowly from lack of air. Number 6. Scaism. Scaism was one of the most gruesome and torturous methods of execution ever devised, and its horror is enough to send chills down anyone's spine. The name Scaism comes from the Greek word for boat, and sometimes it's just called the boats because of the way it worked. Originating from ancient Persia, it was described by Greek historians, but some argue that the details might have been exaggerated or even invented to demonize the Persians. Regardless, the accounts paint a picture of a truly horrific fate. The victim was trapped between two narrow boats or hollowed-out tree trunks, leaving them completely immobilized. They were force-fed a mixture of milk and honey, which, instead of nourishing them, caused severe diarrhea. The milk and honey also began to rot inside the confined space, worsening the victim's condition. But it didn't end there. More milk and honey were smeared over their bodies, attracting swarms of flies, maggots, and other insects. The victim's body was exposed to the brutal heat of the sun, often left for days in this cruel environment. Without the ability to move or escape, they became vulnerable to insect bites and stings, which added to their suffering. The decay of their waste, mixed with the cloying sweetness of the milk and honey, only made the situation worse. Over time, the insects would burrow into their skin, laying eggs that hatched into maggots, leading to even more horrific infections. The slow, agonizing death could come from multiple causes: severe dehydration, shock, blood loss from insect bites, or overwhelming infection. Some victims would also die from exposure to the sun, which, combined with the lack of food and water, would leave them weakened beyond survival. Now it's time for today's subscriber pick. Long ago, in a dark and distant land, a cruel punishment was created for the worst criminals. A man accused of betrayal was tied down, trembling with fear. A large metal container was placed on his chest, and inside it, a starving giant rat scratched and squealed. Then, fire was lit beneath the container. As the heat rose, the panicked rat had only one way to escape: through flesh and bone. The man screamed, but no one helped. It was a terrifying way to die, made to strike fear into the hearts of others. Some whispered it was too cruel, even for the worst. Could such a brutal punishment ever be justified? Let us have your opinions in the comment section below. Number 5. Drawing and quartering. Drawing and quartering was, without a doubt, one of the most nightmarish punishments ever carried out. This happened to real people, not just in horror stories. It began in 13th century England under the rule of King Edward I, and was specifically reserved for men convicted of high treason, which was considered the ultimate betrayal against the king or country. Women found guilty of treason, however, were typically burned at the stake instead, considered more modest at the time. The process was deliberately drawn out and designed to terrify the public as much as punish the traitor. First came the drawing, where the prisoner was tied behind a horse and dragged, sometimes for miles, over cobblestone roads to the execution site. This alone often caused severe injuries. Once there, the person would be hanged until nearly dead, but not quite. Executioners were careful not to kill them immediately. While still alive and conscious, many were disemboweled, their stomachs cut open and internal organs pulled out and burned before their eyes. Some even had their genitals cut off as part of the ritual. After this agonizing torture, the prisoner was beheaded and quartered, meaning their body was chopped into 4 parts. In some cases, each limb was tied to a horse and pulled in different directions until the body split apart. The remains weren't just buried quietly either. They were often displayed across the country, on gates and bridges, as a warning. Though shockingly brutal, this punishment continued for centuries. The last man sentenced to be drawn and quartered in Britain was in 1782, but the practice was only officially abolished in 1867. Number 4. Firing squad. The firing squad might sound like something from the Wild West, but it's still a real and legal method of execution in the United States, though very rarely used. In this method, the inmate is strapped tightly to a chair with leather belts, right in front of a canvas wall, surrounded by sandbags meant to catch the blood. A doctor uses a stethoscope to locate the heart and pins a white cloth target over it. Then, a black hood is pulled over the inmate's head. Firing squads usually consist of trained prison staff standing about 20 to 25 feet away. In most cases, 5 shooters are used, 4 with live bullets and 1 with a blank, so no one knows who fired the fatal shot. However, in South Carolina's version, only 3 shooters are used, and all their rifles are loaded with live rounds. The goal is to hit the heart or a major artery so the prisoner dies quickly from blood loss and shock. If the heart is missed, death can be painfully slow. Since 1977, only 4 inmates have faced the firing squad. One of the most recent was Ronnie Gardner in Utah in 2010. He chose this method over lethal injection. Utah reauthorized firing squads in 2015, but only if lethal injection drugs are unavailable. More recently, on March 7, 2025, South Carolina executed Brad Sigmund by firing squad, the first in the state's history. He picked this method due to ongoing issues with South Carolina's lethal injection drugs and protocols. Interestingly, Mississippi, Oklahoma, and South Carolina have followed Utah's lead in allowing the firing squad as a backup option. Number 3. Boiling. These days, boiling alive sounds like something that only happens to lobsters or crabs. But centuries ago, it was used as a brutal and very real form of execution in different parts of the world, from medieval England to countries across East and Southeast Asia. The method was as horrifying as it sounds. The condemned person was stripped of their clothes and thrown into a cauldron filled with boiling liquid, usually water, oil, pitch, or molten lead. Sometimes, for an even slower and more torturous death, they were placed into cold liquid, which was then gradually heated until it boiled, literally cooking the person alive. In England, this gruesome punishment gained popularity during the reign of King Henry VIII. In 1531, he passed a law specifically allowing people who were murdered by poisoning to be executed by boiling, believing the crime was so evil it deserved a punishment worse than hanging. One of the most infamous cases was that of Richard Rose, a cook who poisoned a pot of porridge intended for a bishop's household. He became the first person officially boiled to death under this law, slowly, in public, and without a shred of mercy. It wasn't just the British. In Japan, criminals could be boiled in huge iron cauldrons. In Mongolia, during the 14th century, enemies of the state were sometimes tossed into boiling milk. Even in the Roman Empire, similar methods existed, though they often preferred molten metal. These brutal executions were meant to terrify the public and keep order through fear. Thankfully, this method was eventually outlawed in most places by the 18th century as societies moved toward more humane punishments. Number 2. Crushed by elephant. This gruesome practice was most common in areas where elephants naturally roamed, particularly in South and Southeast Asia, where elephants have held cultural and symbolic significance for centuries. Known for their immense strength and intelligence, these majestic creatures were trained in specific ways to make the punishment as terrifying and efficient as possible. Elephants were not just used as part of the execution. They were specially trained to maximize the impact. They were taught to stamp on their victims with incredible precision and force. The process involved conditioning the elephants to target vital areas of the body, such as the chest or head, delivering a crushing blow that would almost instantly end the victim's life. This kind of execution was designed to make a powerful statement, not only to punish the individual, but to send a chilling message to the population about the authority of the rulers. In some cultures, this method became a public spectacle, where the elephant's execution would be a terrifying display of power. The practice was also rooted in ancient Indian traditions, where elephants were seen as noble creatures and even used in religious ceremonies. However, the cruelty of using them for executions shows how these powerful animals were twisted into tools of fear and control. Interestingly, the practice persisted for centuries in various forms. In Sri Lanka, for instance, it continued into the colonial era, and even some reports from the 19th century suggest the method was used in other parts of the world, such as Southeast Asia and Africa. Number 1. Breaking wheel. The breaking wheel, often called the Catherine wheel, was one of history's most terrifying execution devices. It got its nickname from Saint Catherine of Alexandria, a Christian martyr who, according to legend, was sentenced to die on this very wheel in the 4th century, but it miraculously broke when she touched it. The wheel itself looked like something off an old wagon, large, wooden, and spoked. But it wasn't used for travel. It was designed purely for torture. Once someone was tied to it, executioners would use clubs, hammers, or iron rods to smash the victim's limbs, one by one, weaving their broken body between the spokes. Sometimes, the person would be left alive for hours, or even days, on display, slowly dying from blood loss, shock, or exposure. In some cases, the wheel was mounted on a tall pole so crowds could see the mangled body from a distance. This cruel method wasn't just about punishment, it was public theater. Executions were held in town squares or on hilltops to terrify people into obedience. In medieval Europe, the wheel was used on thieves, murderers, and traitors. In colonial America, it was even used to punish enslaved people accused of uprising, a dark reminder of how barbaric justice systems can be. Sometimes, if the authorities were feeling merciful, they'd deliver a fatal blow to the chest or head before the rest of the bones were broken, a practice called the coup de grace. The last recorded use of the breaking wheel was in Prussia in 1841, which marked the end of one of history's most gruesome punishments. What are your thoughts about this incredibly shocking way of execution used in United States history? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section below.